Saul, you're a very well-known academic. You're a well-known social scientist, but just tell us how you first became interested in the whole question of young carers.
Well, so when I was a child in my teens, I took on a caring role for my grandmother, who had always lived with my mum and me. My father worked away from home in the hotel business, so my grandmother had Parkinson's disease, and I found myself caring for her alongside with my mother, and I had to do a lot of the caring tasks that we now know are common for young carers, including sort of getting her up at night to help her to the toilet, helping her turn, taking her out in the wheelchair, and all of those kind of things. And those experiences, I think, have really helped to shape and influence my whole life, my values, my approach to work and to family, my choice of profession, and I hope a passion for standing up and speaking out for carers. And at that time, because this was the 1970s, there was no recognition of carers at all, no services, and especially no awareness of young carers. But that's not actually how I got into this, because how I got into the whole field of research, which I've been doing now for the last 30 years, was actually serendipity, not design. And it was one of my master's students when I was a lecturer at university who said to me, Saul, do you think we should try and get some money to do some research on young carers? And he was running a voluntary sector organisation, because the voluntary sector has been really influential here. And I realised when I finally understood what he was talking about, that it was really my own experiences. So we put in a bid and we got some money to do the first piece of research on young carers, and we called it Children Who Care, Inside the World of Young Carers. And it got a lot of publicity, very influential. The Guardian did a big feature on it. And from that, it really took off with lots of different foundations, including Carers Trust and others, really wanting to support a programme of work that's now lasted 30 years, looking at the experiences and needs of young carers in this country and abroad.
And Saul, we'll be talking in a moment about some of the problems young carers face. But before we do that, just listening to what you were saying about your own experience, quite a common view that being forced to become a carer at a young age is somehow a blight and an impoverishment on life. It suggests, from what you've been saying, it can also be a great source of strength throughout adulthood.
So I think that's absolutely true, Andrew. I mean, what we know from lots of research, as I say, 30 years of accumulated knowledge now, is that you can look at the impacts of caring on children in two ways. A lot of the literature has emphasised the negative sides, the impact on their education, their development, their psychosocial development, their mental health, etc., etc. But young carers do talk about the positives as well. It brings them closer to the person that they're looking after. It gives them some control over the family situation. And for people like me, I've been very lucky, I think, that it's given me a strong sense of purpose. It's given me a passion about the interests of young carers and adult carers, and I've been able to draw on those experiences, if you like, to move forward. But I think I'm lucky, Andrew, and there is a whole literature on this as well about how do these things develop resilience. But a lot of young carers have not been so lucky.
No, indeed, it can be a college for empathy or not. I'm very interested, obviously, your kind of experience. We have a kind of natural sense that around us, there are a lot of young people, particularly at the moment, caring for others. But the question about how many seems a difficult one. I went back and looked at the last national census, which gave a figure of 166,000 for the UK. But there are others, I think, including you, who think the real figure is far higher. Can you explain?
Yes, of course. So the original census figures in 2001 and 2011 are based on a question in the census, which is asking effectively the adult in the house, is there someone in your family who provides care? And then it asks them to tick the age and how many hours a week that person cares. And one of the things I'd always argued was that that's not how you're going to really count young carers, because it relies on an adult making a disclosure effectively on a census form that a child is a carer in this family and ticking all the right boxes. So I've always said it will underestimate the true extent of caring. So what I did was 2 surveys for the BBC, in which instead of asking the adult in the household, we asked children in schools whether they provided any care for a family member who had an illness, disability, mental health, or addiction problem. And what we found from doing that, and we've done it twice, is that the figure in the first time was around 700,000 children who were carers, and the figure in the second survey we did a couple of years ago was 800,000. So the census truly underestimates the extent to which children are caring in the UK.
Right. So this is a much bigger issue than many people had realized, just in terms of numbers. Can we jump forward? You've done a lot of research and you've got a close understanding of the effect on young carers of the work they're doing inside the home. Can I ask you about the effect of the last 6 months or so of the coronavirus outbreak on young carers, including on their mental health?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a particularly difficult time for young carers and their families. It's been very hard indeed. What we know from a number of studies, one done by Carers Trust literally just a couple of months ago, is that, of course, young carers are caring for family members who have a heightened vulnerability to COVID-19 because of their underlying health problems. So if we start with that position, and so because of that position, we're also then able to examine what the impact of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown has been. Being in lockdown has certainly meant that young carers have had to take on even more caring. The Carers Trust survey, literally a couple of months ago, found that 6 out of 10 of those young carers were spending more time caring than before the pandemic. And indeed, some said that it was 30 hours or more a week that they were now having to provide care.
And sorry, Saul, is that because of people being forced to shield and therefore being inside for longer, or because of professional carers going from house to house and therefore having the possibility of being super spreaders pulling out of the system?
It's all of those things. So let me just sort of rehearse them with you, really. Young carers said that they were providing more care, that they were having to provide care for more people in the family, because with the pandemic and the lockdown, more people in the family started to develop mental health problems, and then they also needed care and support from the child, the young person. As the lockdown took hold, services that the families used to receive often stopped being delivered because of possible infections. And indeed, very few young carers, only about 3%, received any home care support for the person they cared for during the pandemic, because those services, as you said, simply stopped. And then young carers had no personal protective equipment. They often live in low-income families, and the pandemic stretched already thin household incomes because everyone was locked down together. And some young carers told us that it was even hard to get medicines, shopping, even food and basic supplies. Young carers had to do more with less. And nearly half said that they were unable to take a real break from caring. There was no respite. And because schools had closed, there was no time that young carers could actually spend away from the person that they cared for. And of course, for many of those young carers, their education actually just stalled. The majority of the young carers in the Carers Trust survey said that they felt overwhelmed by the new pressures of having to care in a lockdown situation, with less support, in fact, very little support from home-based services that used to be provided from local authorities, health or social care agencies. And also they talked about the stress of losing their connections with friends and with their local communities because of being locked down. So there's a whole range of different factors there that come into play, and including, as you mentioned at the end, an exacerbation of young carers' own mental health. We're doing a big study, Andrew, in 6 European countries at the moment, looking at young carers' mental health. So we have a very clear idea of their vulnerability to mental health difficulties. And that was before the pandemic. And what we can now see clearly is that the pandemic and the lockdown in particular has severely exacerbated those feelings of anxiety, of stress, of disconnectedness. I mean, we call it sometimes anomie in sociology, this notion that there's just nothing there that's holding and bonding everything together. And that's been a real problem. And many young carers are saying they need additional support with their emotional needs and their mental health needs.
Well, let's talk a little bit then about that additional support, because obviously we're all learning to work differently during this pandemic. Do you think that, for instance, the Carers Trust partner organisations need to rethink about how they support young carers going forward?
I think that everyone needs to rethink how we're going to do life from now on. You know, you just look around, you look on the streets, you look in the shops. This is not the society that we knew 7 months ago. Everything has changed, and the patterns of work and the patterns for leisure and recreation will have to change as a consequence of this. Whenever this pandemic is over, we know that COVID-19 is not going to be gone forever. And so we have to adapt to a changing society, a changing economy. And so one of the things that Carers Trust partners will need to do is to rethink how will they offer and what kinds of services will they provide, because carers and young carers' expectations have changed through these experiences. And I think we have found that online, Zoom and all of these things can work, they can be efficient, they can be effective, but they don't actually replace the need that many people have for face-to-face, real-time, in-person interactions. And so I think for the Carers Trust and the partners, the future isn't simply online, nor is it face-to-face. It's what we call blended. The future is blended in that we will need to reconfigure and reconceptualize the services that we offer to carers and across our society and economy as a blended experience which combines online with real life interactions.
Saul, let's talk a little bit about the money, because we all know that really ever since the original financial crisis and the austerity years, some of these services have been underfunded, and there's been a particular problem with local authority funding for years now. Looking forward, if you were able, as it were, to address either the Chancellor of the Exchequer or Prime Minister, or on the other hand, representatives of local authorities trying to work out how best to allocate still scarce resources to help carers and this massive, massive subterranean industry, as it were, over the next few years, what would you be telling them?
So this is a really good question, Andrew. I think, you know, if I was talking to local authorities or to political parties or manifestos or whatever is going to come out over the next few months or the next year, I would really be saying that, and you won't be surprised to hear me say that, they really need to commit to the needs of carers. For example, I think that local authorities, before they introduce or enact any piece of legislation or policy, they need to ensure that it's carer safe, carer friendly. You know, they need to do what I would call a carer impact assessment, which is, if the policy that you are going to introduce, whether it's in transport or social care or housing or whatever, is going to damage the interests of carers, then don't introduce it. That's a simple thing. I would also say that for local authorities, they need to commit more money and resources to carers. And again, you won't be surprised that I say that, but it seems to me that we have to treat the spend on carers not as a cost, but as an investment. It's an investment in an infrastructure, in a hidden army of people, some of whom are very young and some of whom are older, who are effectively keeping our economy and our society going. They are, if you like, enabling other people to go to work. They're enabling our society to function because they are taking up the strain of so many parts of our economy and our society. So I would be saying to those people, invest in carers, develop services that support them, that give them a life of their own, and that give carers and their families hope for a better future.
Now, somebody in my position is always talking to politicians and saying this or this cause needs more money and needs more attention. And that's absolutely right. But it strikes me that actually civil society and, you know, the mosaic or network of other organizations ranging from, you know, faith groups to choirs to clubs and societies of different kinds also need to be part of this rethinking of how we support carers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, the support of carers isn't just a matter for governments or policymakers. It is a matter, it's everyone's business. And that's a cliche to some extent, but it is the truth. Informal family carers are, if you like, the backbone of civic society, along with voluntary organisations, charities, educational establishments, etc. And it is everyone's responsibility to think through, in whatever field that people work, including actually private enterprise, industry, the banking sector, etc., etc. What is it that we can do by ourselves as an organisation, but collectively, that will improve the lives of carers that are in our organisations and that carers that we simply do not know? So it is very much about a call to arms for civic society to engage with local and public authorities and with the private sector, Andrew, to, if you like, deliver a sea change in the interests of family carers and young carers.
Well, that certainly resonates with me. We've all had caring experiences. And it does strike, I look around friends and family, wider networks, and in every vulnerable area, there is somebody living inside the house who's actually providing a level of support that no state, however intrusive, could match.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, Andrew, if you don't mind.
No.
So I've talked about the invisibility of carers, and the fact that a few decades ago, there was no services or recognition for carers at all. We have moved a long way, thank goodness, since that time, because we do have services now. We do have Carers Trust. We have the local network partners, etc. And I suppose I'm really interested to know, when did you as an individual really start to understand and appreciate the importance of family carers within your own sphere of experience?
It's a very good question, Saul. And the answer is embarrassingly late in my life, really, because my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, my wife's father, Lord Ashley, Jack Ashley, Labour MP, who was profoundly deaf and spent a lot of his time on the back benches campaigning highly successfully for disablement rights and more help for disabled people, including through carers. And when he became older and iller himself, then he had professional carers, certainly, but really he needed quite a lot of the family to rally around and help as well. And we had relatively young children at the time, classic sandwich situation. But it is a period I look back to with great affection, actually. We learned a great deal from him when we were caring from him or helping to care for him. So that was the first moment, I think. And then, of course, it's actually nearly 8 years ago now, I had a very major stroke. And I'm relatively fine. I'm still a bit disabled, but I can carry on living my life and working and enjoying life. But for quite a period, immediately after the stroke, there was some question as to whether I'd be able to walk again or dress myself or wash myself, all of those basic things. And my long-suffering wife had to move in and become my carer with a lot of help from my children as well, I have to say, at that time. So I saw it from the other side, if you like, Saul, that actually, all of us, one way or another, may find ourselves at a point in our lives where we are looking around our loved ones, our wider family, and saying, would you mind doing this for me? And, we absolutely depend on the practical abilities and the grace of people around us to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Andrew. I'm also interested, if I may ask you, when you do your Sunday show and all the other shows that you do, what has been your impression when you speak to the Chancellor or the Prime Minister or others? What do you get is what's your sense of their commitment to family carers?
So I think the writer Madeline Bunting has just written a book about care. And in that, she says there's a very strange sort of political atmosphere around this issue. And we kind of seesaw between a sense of imminent crisis and something needs to be done, and either boredom or exhaustion on the other hand, lassitude. And I think the real problem with the whole issue of care, whether it's young carers or family care or professional care, is the cost of paying for it. Because we all know these things don't come cheap, and eventually people need support, and that needs to be paid for. And I think that came to a head at the time, the second last election, when Theresa May got into a lot of trouble with the so-called dementia tax. Her idea was obviously that people with relatively wealthy houses or expensive houses ought to be able to mortgage those or sell those on ahead to pay for their own care. And that went down like a lead balloon across the Tory shires. And since then, almost every senior politician, Labour or Tory, has talked a great deal about the importance of a care revolution a national care service to match the NHS, really dealing with the care problem. Boris Johnson talks about it all the time. And so far, Saul, almost nothing has happened because they can see a lot of ordinary voters having to reach into their pockets. And if you like, the pervasive political cynicism says, in the end, they won't vote to pay more money for anything, including care. That is the single biggest problem, I think.
And I think that's the sort of the tragedy of it all, isn't it? Because a few moments ago you mentioned to me, what would I ask if I was talking to the Chancellor or to the Prime Minister, or what would I ask you to ask? And I suppose I suppose what I would ask them is, how would they want to be remembered? Would they want to be remembered as the person who stood with carers and did something about this issue, or as the politician who spoke those fancy words that you refer to and didn't change anything? And whilst it is a rhetorical flight of fancy in a way to talk about a care revolution, I do genuinely believe that if we don't address this, and as you say, because many of us will become carers in our own lifetimes, if we don't address this properly once and for all, we are condemned to repeating the mistakes of the past and to, if you like, denying carers of hope.
I'm afraid that is absolutely right, Saul. I would like to end on a note of relative optimism, however, because you look inside the Conservative Party and you see people like Jeremy Hunt now chairing a select committee in the House of Commons, who has really got I think does understand the central importance of care in any political agenda going forward. We've got a Liberal Democrat leader who has spent a lot of time talking about being a carer himself and who's vowed to make caring absolutely central to his politics. I think that's admirable and interesting. And indeed in Keir Starmer, alongside Ed Davey, we've got a Labour leader who has talked a lot about care and a lot about the problems his mother faced when he was growing up, and I think has a more immediate and visceral understanding of these issues. And I think it's only when we get politicians at the top of politics, of whatever party, who really have gone through it themselves, understand what it means, that we'll see this issue properly at the forefront of politics. But I think the next general election will, or at least has the possibility of being the care election.
And I think, Andrew, what I would want to add to that, because I agree with everything you've just said, is that this means that the role of organisations like Carers Trust, which is respected and trusted, and the voice it gives to carers is even more important now. Now is that critical time. I think it is a moment in time in which we have everything to fight for in the best interests of carers, and united, we can deliver real change going forward.
Saul, more power to your elbow. It's been a delightful, entertaining and very, very interesting conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Can't always say that at the end of a Sunday morning. But
Thank you so much. It's
all right.
been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks.